had as a backlog of things that were coming from the several years ago on the 3 pillars, but mainly in domestic support. And there were a couple of relatively new themes that are not in the center of the 3 traditional pillars, which were public stocks, fisheries, which you can incorporate into sort of the agricultural themes, and not much more. And the application of facilitation of commerce, which is actually a much amplier thing than agriculture in itself. As you all know, the negotiations are taking place in a difficult moment, and as you probably all know, it seems that progress will be very limited. So one of the questions, and thinking a little bit on this before the meeting, we said, bueno, one of the risks is that if there's no big, important progress in this meeting, maybe agricultural negotiations will sort of die by themselves. There will be no themes sufficiently important to capture the interest of the negotiating countries to carry on the exercise and the process of agricultural negotiations. So we thought one of the things we could do is think in some new themes that are not being negotiated in the MC11, but that we could sort of introduce them here in MC11 with the idea that they can become a negotiating theme in the next following at the end of this meeting. And the 2 themes we thought we incorporated into the discussion were 2 themes that are not totally new. One refers to restrictions to food exports. That has been a theme that has been negotiated a number of times, or have been considered a number of times in the context of WTO, however, with no progress. And our understanding is the main reason of why no progress is because the exporters were never offered something against it. They were just asking the exporting countries to not use that policy instrument. So after the discussion, there's a proposal that will be made. And the second theme has to do with environmental standards. It's something that is around a long time, but has never been discussed really within the context of the WTO. And there also, Gustavo will present sort of a suggestion, a proposal of how it could be incorporated in the table of the WTO negotiations. So there are 2 new proposals, or 2 suggestions of themes that could be incorporated in the negotiations in the future, with the expectation that this might provide some energy for the discussions after MC11. We have agreed the order of the presentations. Valeria will start the interventions, making mainly, or dealing mainly with the export restrictions, what we have done, what has been done by countries, and an estimation of the very negative impacts that they have. And Eduardo Bianchi will mainly present the proposal of how this could be incorporated in the table. And then Gustavo will deal with environmental standards. Every speaker has 15 minutes at the most. And if it's less, much better, because that would leave some time for discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I need to start apologizing. As you can tell, I'm losing my voice, so I will try to do my best to be as clear as possible. But please, if I'm too loud or too or not, please let me know. I can't even hear myself, so I will try to be as clear as possible. As Martin said, the idea of my presentation is just to stick to the facts. So where is exactly export restrictions, how have been they used in today and in recent years, and also to illustrate 2 different examples. So the first one, we will use the general equilibrium model, a global model, which is MIRAGRODEP, and it will just illustrate what's going to be the impact of the total elimination of export taxes, just the taxes, not all other restrictions, in a global level. So what if all the world decided to eliminate these taxes? This work has been done by David Laborde, that he's at the back of this room, and Antoine Bouet. Both of them are my colleagues from IFPRI. And then the second illustration we would like to use is to just use Argentina as a case study. So what happens if only one large exporter decides to eliminate their export taxes? And in this case, we also included the export restrictions, given that export restrictions was also a big thing in Argentina in last years with all the ROE. So this work also, we did it with David Laborde, Pablo Alberdin, that he's here, and he also works with us at IFPRI and GPS. And then Eugenio Diaz Bonilla, that he also is a colleague of mine from IFPRI. Again, I'm just going to just pinpoint a couple of results from these two studies. Of course, that the studies are way larger and they are more, if you read them, you will get definitely more information. I'm just going to use a couple of graphs just to illustrate. Both of these publications are available at the IFPRI website. And the one of export restrictions in Argentina is one of the chapters of a new book that we wrote with all of them, as a matter of fact. So it's 6 institutions that are part of the books, which is GPS, ICTSD, IFPRI, IICA, Bolsa de Cereales, and INAI. And the book launch is tonight here at 6:30. So for whoever is interested in really looking at that book, it's a very interesting one as well. So I'm going to start. Hopefully you don't count those 15 minutes for the intro I just said, but I will do my best to stick to the time. Here we go. This is not me. Okay. So, not me? No? Here we go. Okay, then you will need to go back, okay? No, this one is mine, so I'm fine, but then you will have to go all back. So, first of all, I need to introduce this conversation, which is explaining a little bit of the reasons for imposing export restrictions in the world. Many countries justify imposing these restrictions by 5 things. The first one is terms of trade. So if a country wants to have a benefit terms of trade, they think that if they restrict the supply, the domestic supply in terms of exports, so if they restrict their exports, the international price will be higher and they will be benefit by that. The second case is food security. This is in general the one that is most used and is better justified in a way. And there are 2 different things. The first one is, of course, that the major goal is to keep domestic prices low. So when you're talking about food security, if there is a staple that it is very important for the basket consumption of poor people or the least income families, keeping an export tax or an export restriction will keep domestic prices low. The other case is in the case of maybe an import surge. So what happens if there is, through climate change, for example, there's a reduction in the supply of a cereal in a different country. So that will create that international prices are higher and there will be an incentive for domestic producers to export more. So sometimes it's justified to put an export ban or an export tax in order to keep exports restricted. Then there is the case of the local agro-industry. So this is the case that if a country has, for example, the case of the soybeans is a very clear case for this. In general, if a country has the production of soys, but they also have the production of the vegetable oil, so keeping a tax for the raw commodity will keep prices low for the raw commodity, which it will be a less price for the input that then the vegetable oil uses, so that it will make them more competitive. The fourth one is, of course, government revenue. We will see in some of the slides far away that it is very important for some countries, and some countries that cannot depend on collecting revenues from different sources, they find that this one is a very easy one to collect, so they tend to actually use export taxes for this. And then, of course, the redistribution of income, in which case, there will be a movement of money from the producers to the consumers of the government. So what are some findings that literature has given us? First of all, that the export restrictions operate by changing the progressive supply decisions. So a producer will decide now, instead of selling it outside as exports, to just keep it domestically. And the effect is that they will introduce a wedge between the domestic and the international price. This brings a very different case if the country that imposes the restriction is a small exporter or if it is a large exporter. If it is a small exporter, in general, the only effect you actually see is just transfer from the producers, the domestic producers, to the consumers and the government. But you can keep this effect only domestically. Then if you're a large supplier, a large exporter, the situation changes, because if you are a large exporter, you can also change the international price. So all these problems also are translated into different countries. So now it's not only your own domestic producers that transfer money to your domestic consumers or government, it also affects the importers. So it also affects producers and consumers in different countries. This is just to quantify a little bit what export restrictions and export taxes and all different kind of actually export restrictions have been used lately. So this is a work by Carmen Estrada and her colleagues, in which they used a period between 2005 and 2014, and here we can see the different measures that have been implemented in the short term or in the long term. By commodities is the first graph, and then we have another graph with type of measures and the justification of why they are deciding to use these export restrictions. So apart from this, something else that we can learn from the work they did is that something they found was the use of export restrictions increases with the degree of diversification of the economy, implying that medium and large countries are more prone to use them than smaller developing countries. Another finding that they had is that there was both an increase in the number of countries importing the export restrictions as well as in the number of products affected by these restrictions. And the commodities that were affected most of the times were cereals, fats and oils, products of the milling industry, meat and live animals. Then I also found that this graph actually is very interesting. In this graph we can see the number of measures and also the food price index, the FAO food price index. And we can really very clearly hear that the two peaks were in 2008 and 2011, and those combine exactly the two peaks in the prices. So you can see that the top line is the FAO index, and as you can see, those are exactly the same peaks than in terms of the bars. Okay, now we're just going to talk a little bit about the global model again. In this case, all export taxes were eliminated, not only in the agricultural sector, but also in the industry and the energy sector. So in this one, for example, in the one on the left, we can see that in all the regions, the most important one are changes in exports. This is in volume. It's in the energy sector, with some exceptions, and it's Argentina, Western Africa, and Asia, in which the elimination of export taxes, the agricultural export taxes, are the ones that are more important for these countries. And then we can see that the Middle East and North Africa and China, the biggest impact is actually in the industrial sector. And then the other graph on the right, it just talks about reductions in prices. In these ones that we reported here are only the ones that have the biggest changes. So you can see that there are actually big changes, and of course that they are all negative, being the most important the energy and forestry and the energy products. Now we will move to the case of the large exporters. So this is the case of Argentina eliminating all export taxes and export restrictions. Of course, that we actually left the oilseed value chain characteristic in Argentina, so it's not totally eliminated here. But looking at these two tables, what we can see is that the decrease in the world prices of soybeans and grains will negatively impact the countries that produce those commodities. So in this case, it will be Brazil and NAFTA, but it will benefit all the other countries that import these commodities. So as I just said, all countries see positive welfare effects except the ones that actually produce them as well. And then the other two tables that I wanted to show you with respect to the same study is that we can see that the Argentine economy will actually grow. The number here seems very small, is 0.13 percentage change with respect to the baseline. Remember that this is a general equilibrium model, so you always do a business as usual run, and you compare that line with the one you will obtain if you actually do the policy or the shock. So in this case, as you can see, it is very small. One thing is the assumption that we have full employment, so that employment wasn't changing much. And then something that will bring up in the conclusions is what happens with the government deficit. And I will come back to this. And then if we look at the right-hand table, we can see that commodities in which export restrictions were eliminated or reduced, production increased at the expense of the ones that they didn't have any kind of restriction originally. And then this is something interesting, just to mention again, what's the role of the government deficit in this kind of analysis. And we can see that in all these countries, the percentage of the revenue generated export taxes are very small, except the countries that have the blue circle around them. And of course, that Argentina is one of them. So when we look at countries with this kind of situation, we have to be extremely careful because can have different implications if we want to try to eliminate them. In the study that I just mentioned about Argentina, we can see that in the case that we leave, we can let the government deficit grow. The deficit will actually grow by quite a lot. And this also causes a crowding out effect on investment, so that will also affect how much or the rate of growth of the economy in general. The other thing we need to be careful in looking is what are the short run versus the long run effects. I just have one more. And we have to make sure that we understand that even though export restrictions in general, they are assumed to be temporary in nature, they can have long-lasting effects. And the two ones that I think that are a more important one is that they will reduce the profitability of the sector that you actually are imposing the restriction. So in the longer run, the incentive to invest in that sector will kind of disappear. So which you thought that at some point the sector was going to be very profitable and one that you can actually rely on, if you continue doing that in the long term, you see that it's hit very hard. And then the other one is the decrease in the import demand from the country with a ban. So it means that other countries will decide, well, we can get the exports from this country, so we're just going to find a new partner or a new provider. And that also affects in the longer run. And then just to conclude, I just have some final comments. And this is based in other studies. And we can see that export restrictions seem to be not able to decouple domestic prices from world market prices, and this is work done by Goetz et al. In 2014. And then we see that they are not very effective at reducing domestic prices, and that they actually contribute to the volatility in the international prices. A lot of work has been done by Martin and Anderson with respect to this. And then just to finish this with, again, emphasizing the importance of looking at the government deficit when you're talking about these kind of policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Eduardo. El aparatito.
this session, especially because it's lunchtime, so I appreciate very much. To set the stage for my presentation, let me begin with a scientific fact. More agricultural trade will be needed in the near future. And appreciate that I am using the word scientific fact. And I will explain in the next slide why I'm using this adjective. Almost all the academies of science of the world have joined together to work on food and nutrition security, a view from the academies of sciences. For example, in the case of the America, more than 200 scientists and experts joined together in a cooperative work for 2 years to write this report. And there are a lot of conclusions, a lot of issues that these different reports are tackling. Different because there is a report for the Americas, there is another report for Asia, another report for Africa, and another report for Europe. The next year, a consolidated report will be disseminated, for example, in size 20. So this work, the scientific work, indicates that we have a very important global challenge. And it is that the population is growing. As you can see, it is projected to be like 9 million people in 2050. But at the same time, food demand will increase. But at the same time, food supply is slowing because of production constraints in resources, finite resources, land, water, fisheries. So more food must be produced with the same or even less amount of land. And there are, for example, climate change that will make this situation worse, because climate change will imply that agricultural production will decrease. Let me show just 2 graphs for illustrating what I'm saying. You can see that during the last year, what the source of growth in global agricultural output was factor productivity. This green part of the graph. But in order to feed population in 2050, we need to increase the productivity by, I cannot see from here, by 1.75%. The current rate of growth in productivity is slower of that rate, and it is even slower in low-income countries. So we have a problem, a very big problem between demand and between food and demand supply, and that's why I begin saying that we will need science, we will need technology, we will need innovation, but we also will need trade, agricultural trade. And we will need agricultural trade without distortions. And Valeria talked about the effects of one of the biggest distortions that agricultural trade has in these moments. This is the export restrictions. Let me just go very quickly saying that the measures that were applied in the last 2 food crises cover almost 75% of all agricultural products. let me say that export taxes were applied by 65 countries, that there are a lot of empirical work showing that these measures affect the price of food. And at the same time that the exporters apply export restrictions, the importers try to decrease import tariff. So this game is a prisoner dilemma where both players lose if they do not cooperate. So the not cooperative option is and will be in the future very costly. So what rules do we have now to tackle export restriction? Export restriction, I understand quantitative restriction and also export restrictions. Well, we have Article 11 from GATT 1994, but that in paragraph A, it refers to foodstuff, but there are a lot of terms that, for example, temporarily, prevent, relieve, critical, shortage, that make this article very difficult to enforce. And at the same time, export taxes are not regulated in the WTO agreements. That's a very important point. So you have an regulation or asymmetry between export measures and import measures. Import measures are regulated, while export measures are not regulated in the WTO. Nevertheless, stricter rules on export restriction have been adopted in recent years in two cases. In the case of regional trade agreements, many of them include limitations on the use of export restrictions, which are stronger than those included in WTO agreement. For example, there are disciplines on export taxes. And the other place where stricter rules are adopted is in the case of new countries joining the WTO. Some of these new members had accepted obligations on export restrictions that go beyond existing WTO rules. And also they compromise to eliminate not only export quantitative restrictions, but also export taxes. That implies another asymmetry, in this case, between the new countries that enter into the WTO and the existing WTO members. So there are good reasons to avoid the effect of export restrictions, to restore the confidence in international trade, to have a credible coordination to avoid all countries losing, to have a consistency approach, tackling this asymmetry between members or among members, the recognition of stricter rules in regional trade agreement, and also the opportunity to eliminate the asymmetry between import and export regulations within the WTO. So we need a cooperative and multilateral approach to avoid this prisoner dilemma trap. And let me now finish my presentation with an intrepid proposal. And let me have a recognition to Martin that insisted me to use my brain to sketch a proposal under the strong assumption that there is some gray matter in my brain. And the proposal is this one, and is to link, I cannot see very well the slide, is to link the export restriction with the import tariff escalation. Entonces, export taxes. First, to reduce bound import tariff for agricultural products. There's a lot of, when I was here for a session from FAO, when I went out, I found this paper that is evolution of tariff and tariff escalation. It's very, very good. And it shows that the gap between the bound import tariff and the applied tariff is very big. So the first thing, ambitious, is to close this gap between bound import tariff and applied rates. Second step, to set bound import tariff for processed goods at the same bound level of the first raw material of the production or value chain. So, for example, you can see that there is a lot of escalation in the case of this work of FAO. In the case of cocoa, chocolate has a greater or bigger tariff than cocoa beans. So what we are proposing is that all the processed goods that come from the first raw material have the same bound import tariff. The third point is that for the same production chain, set bound export taxes at the same level of bound import tariff. And so we have a discipline on export taxes, and we have it's like a mirror. Bound export taxes would be the same as bound import tariff, and that will give us a rule on export taxes. We can think of an agreement for each agricultural product. For example, an agreement for wheat, an agreement for cocoa, an agreement for different type of commodities. We can think, I don't know if you can see it, but it's in the last line, between a multilateral or plurilateral agreement, and obviously with flexibilities and special treatment for LDCs. And that disciplines for export taxes, together with these disciplines for export quantitative restrictions. First, that existing export prohibitions and quantitative restrictions in food products shall be eliminated by the end of the first year of implementation of this agreement. And this implies a modification of Article 11.2a of GATT 1994. Any new prohibition or quantitative restriction under this article should not be longer than 12 months and shall only be longer than 18 months with agreement of the affected importing members if the exporter country guarantees normal import levels. This is the average, for example, the average bilateral import volume in the last 3 years before the export restriction. This is the reverse tariff quota approach. Also, there must be some implementation period and flexibilities, and that's why what the proposals that we think about. But the main point is let me go back, is to link an agreement on export restriction to import, to the elimination of import tariff escalation. Here the thought is that the export countries will not give up a policy space without obtaining nothing in exchange. So we think that this can be a feasible agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. Then Gustavo.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for the invitation. As you can see, this is a panel in reference to new topics of the WTO agenda. I'm not going to talk about export restrictions, but I'm going to focus in different topics, which is very well demanded at social level and globally in reference to environment. Can be any linkage between environmental discussions, WTO discipline, and agriculture trade? Well, we are convinced that it is, and there is a good opportunity for doing that. But we need to revert and we need to modify the way that we are thinking and talking about environmental discipline at global trade rules and tendencies. Let me try to find my presentation. If I don't worry for that, because many of the figures that I pretend to show to you that have been already shared from Eduardo. So let me just go. No, it's going to the other side. I think so. Anyway, the idea is quite simple. In 2013, we need to feed the planet with more than 1 billion people more than currently we have. Meaning with that we have only around between 6 to 8 harvests to try to produce food for more than 1 billion people that will be living in this planet. How to do it? Then we need clearly an economic incentive. There are two types of economic incentives. Increasing prices, so we increase production, and we reduced any kind of import restrictions. Increasing pricing will depend on different inputs, but not particularly on WTO disciplines. But the second chance is to try to supply and try to produce all the food that we need and then try to reduce all the problem on food security, is trying to introduce new WTO disciplines in reference to two things. First of all, we cannot produce any more food as we did in the past, because we need to produce in an environmental efficient way. We are not talking about only how to produce on the primary sector, but also in the whole processing of production and transport and logistics and the way that we are eating the food also. So environmental discussion at the WTO was part of the Doha agenda. In fact, it was part of the mandate. In 2001, many countries convinced developing countries, particularly Argentina and Mercosur countries, that we always been opposed to discuss any kind of environmental discussion at WTO, because for only one reason. We consider that the environment is a non-tariff barrier. Anytime that we detect any measures in reference to environment, we have a negative approach for that, and we claim and we request it to the other country to try to avoid it or try to modify such rule. But we, as a group, as GPS, we've been reflecting and analyzing that we need to try to modify this kind of view and try to get a proactive approach about environment. What kind of environmental guidelines and rules can we have in order to fulfill this global demand to increase 70% of the current production in only 6 or 7 harvests from now on? How to do it? So WTO has an stupendous opportunity to try to revert the current crisis that we are suffering during this week in Buenos Aires, not only for the US trade representative comments, but also for the global environment, which is totally negative to the WTO discussion, and try to include new agenda topics like environmental agenda into the WTO. how to do it? Well, they have developed on the Doha mandate a particular paragraph, which is paragraph 31.3, which gives a mandate to the members, to the countries, to start negotiations with a view to eliminate or reduce tariff on different environmental products and services. That sounds very well. How they did it? In this paragraph, in this mandate, 46 countries decided to intervene. Not particularly Mercosur countries, because we consider as a non-tariff barrier, so we decided to avoid and not to be part of that discussion at the very beginning. But other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Arabia, and other countries decided to join this initiative, and right now they identify something like 410 products from all kinds of products which nothing to do with environmental efficiency product, but the only condition was that it was the best product to be exported by that country. Colombia put coffee. Peru put fishery product. Arabia put oil product. Those are environmental efficient product? Well, nobody knows that, because it was not a scientific criteria to try to figure out what kind of product are environmental or not. So that kind of dialogue finished around, or not finished, it's like WTO, continue ongoing discussion, but without any result, on 2014. So they went to see Davos. They went to see the World Economic Forum and say, listening, you are entrepreneurs and companies, why don't you try to figure out how to deal with that? But the World Economic Forum started conversation saying, well, we can try to set up some guidelines how WTO can try to deal with that. But at the end, today, we don't have an agenda on environmental efficiency product and talking about WTO. But we have a challenge, a common challenge. How can we fit the planet? So from our view, WTO has a tremendous opportunity. And this is quite simple. So we proposed, I realized that I never put my presentation, sorry for that. I think it's coming. Let's go to the last one. No, I think it's not there. So we propose something quite simple. We say, well, we are going to talk about agriculture, that's our business. That's the reason why we live, or at least we try to live for. So we propose only on agriculture, which is one of the tough discussions in WTO. We propose a new discipline on environment. Then we said, well, this kind of discipline should follow up only one methodology, a universal methodology. So we propose an ISO rule. There is a particular ISO rule on environmental product, and then any country that can want to introduce a product, only agricultural product, on this proposal, they have to prove on this ISO methodology that the product has a balance, carbon balance, neutral or negative, or positive, sorry. Meaning with that sequestration is longer than emissions. So all the products from countries that can certify or can demonstrate on a scientific basis that there are benefits for environment, the counterpart means that zero duty and no tariff measures should be implemented in all the countries globally. Meaning with that, the WTO can easily identify a discipline, a very transparent discipline, but countries need to prove on an ISO standard that they fulfill, not particularly with all products, but only with the product that can be in that particular category. Meaning with that we are collaborating with climate change, we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also we are collaborating with food security. All of that under the umbrella of the WTO. So we are convinced that this kind of idea could be good for two reasons. The first reason is that we are trying to give an answer to the food security problems. And the second one is that we are trying to give a new opportunity to the WTO, particularly for NGOs and others stakeholders that always criticize WTO discussions. What kind of product can be there? Fruit, vegetables, milk product, meat, oilseed, biofuels, of course, and many others can be there. Is that we are talking only about Mercosur countries? No, not at all. In fact, Spain, with the production of orange, that they can easily be certified as carbon neutral, and all other kind of products. So why we can deny this new guideline? Well, we are convinced that any country should refuse that. If they refuse that, is that probably they don't care about food security or they don't care about environmental protection of climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Eduardo and Valeria. We do have time for questions and answers and comments. As you have seen there, or heard, there are two proposals, quite challenging indeed. I'm sure there are many questions or comments questioning the proposals. Vasco? No.
Yes, I'd like to pursue this question about the environmental standards and the carbon footprinting a little bit more.
Speak loud, please.
Okay, I'd like to pursue that question about the carbon footprinting and standards. As far as I can see, at least on the information that we have available, there are very few agricultural products which are truly carbon neutral. I mean, they have different carbon footprints. That's clear, depending on production methods and so on, but the vast majority have some carbon footprint. Now, the carbon footprint can differ across countries, of course, depending on their production systems. So I think what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure if this is what you're saying, is that we provide some preferential access for products based on their carbon footprint. Okay, good, you're nodding your head, right. Okay, so if we do this, of course, then we throw out the window the like products condition which applies under TBT and so on, because now what we're saying is that, for example, beef, just to be controversial, beef from Argentina is not the same as beef from New Zealand or Australia or wherever. And those products would be eligible, presumably, for differential treatment based on their carbon footprint. I think that's what would be implied by this. I think that that's an interesting idea, except if you think about it, when we're talking about trade flows and competitiveness, it's not purely a function of carbon footprint, is it? I mean, the price at which products come in is affected by the whole range of production costs, and therefore countries can differ in terms of their competitiveness, not only on the basis of their production system and what carbon it generates, but on a whole host of other things, labor costs, costs of raw materials, and so on. So you could envisage a situation where you might have two countries. One of them has a slightly lower emissions, let's say, on that product than another country, but they have a much higher price because they're relatively inefficient in other regards. And so you give them preferential access, but the other country you don't. Now, I suspect that the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO would be working overtime on that one, because the country that was disadvantaged would then say, this is protectionism. This is what you're doing. You're basically protecting. So it's an interesting idea. And as panelists know here, I also suggested some similar ideas yesterday. But my proposal was that we use the carbon footprinting as a labeling initiative, rather than a trade policy initiative, because it's different. If you can get agreement on use of labeling based on accepted international standards, that does allow countries who have a carbon advantage to differentiate and to expand their trade. But you don't do it by affecting things at the border. You do it by allowing labeling inside, so there's no differentiation, there's no discriminatory treatment between domestically produced products that are competing, that have a certain carbon footprint, and the ones that are coming in. It's an equality of opportunity, but consumers can base their decisions both on price and on the carbon footprint. So I'd like to get some reaction to that, because it seems to me that the problem with trying to deal with this through trade measures is that we're just layering an incredible level of complexity onto what is an already highly complex situation. And I just fear that we're never going to get agreement on that. And even if we did, it probably wouldn't prove to be workable.
Thank you. Gustavo?
Well, you are also absolutely right about the challenge on this idea. When we wrote this idea with Sabine, who is here, we thought that we want to create a kind of panic on the room. And then I think that at least with you, we did it. But the idea is that, exactly, because WTO, for our understanding on agricultural discussion, is absolutely dead on market access. How try to find other ways to reopen discussion, real discussions, on market access. So we discussed internally how to do it and how to include environmental discussions at WTO dialogue on market access for agriculture. You are right about the problems. We don't want to talk about labeling because we consider that labeling should be outside WTO discussions. But when we are talking about this preferential access, we are not saying that this is the only preferential access. We are saying that this is only a way to try to concede and try to give preferential access if you fulfill these specific criteria. It doesn't mean that WTO need to increase and improve market access and import tariff reduction formulas for all agricultural products. We are saying that on having that baseline, we can increase and improve and go into zero duty if you fulfill this specific methodology. It's a question of like product. It can be, but it is true that under TBT agreement, you have environmental protection as a legitimate objective. So let's see how a panel can react to a kind of agreement on that. But you are right about the concern, but we want to open a new discussion at WTO on market access.
Thank you, Gustavo. Any other question or comment? I'm surprised that in Argentina, nobody's saying anything about export restrictions. You realize that Argentina has applied export restrictions for 50 or 70 years. Most people have been in agreement with that because that's the reason why the politicians have been able to put the restrictions. So I would imagine that saying Argentina will make un compromiso, an agreement, not to ever again use export restrictions should create some nervousness in somebody.
I have a comment on that. I don't know if I can talk on that.
Bueno. Dale.
First of all, I think that... Marcelo.
Micrófono.
Actually, I share totally what Valeria has mentioned, and I think for Argentina, export restrictions have been very bad from different point of views. We wrote some paper on that, showing what happened and which was the impact of these restrictions on domestic prices and inflation control, so I share totally. The point here is, I'm trying to ask to both, until today we didn't find how we can deal in the trade.
Long term, that's a bad measure, but that is also true. The other day there was a guy from India that said that maybe in the short term you need that measure for food security purposes, and that's why we propose a period, when you can use this kind of measure.
Thank you, Eduardo. Any other question? If not, I will ask Gustavo, that really wants to be on that side of the room, to make his comment.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that export duties are not a subsidy in any way, in any form. As Eduardo has mentioned, are outside any WTO discipline, so any country can do a specific policy at the level they want without any specific argument at the WTO. That's the first topics to understand. The second topics is that even if that is very interesting, the proposal, I think that we need to understand that the only way for a developing country without any subsidy on behalf to support production and export are differential export taxes. This is the only add value policy that the developing country can have. We can discuss the distortion, we can discuss the effect price, the prices effect, we can discuss also revenues, which is quite true. This is the first motivation for all the countries, but the only add value policy that we can have to try to be competitive on a very distortive market with subsidies, with amber boxes subsidies plus import duties and tariff escalation is differential export taxes. So I think if we are going to negotiate export taxes, we need to include on the other side, on the importers, all kind of rules, distortive rule, including amber boxes, blue box, I mean with that all the domestic subsidies distorted, plus import tariff. And only to reduce and eliminate on a phasing out program of export subsidies at the end of the process that they have already eliminate all kind of distortion, not at the beginning of that. That's only my comment.
You think that is not sufficient? What? Bueno, sorry, ¿querías decir algo? ¿Querías decir algo? Any other question, comment? I realize that we need to make an internal discussion here at the end of the panel. Bueno, if there's no other question or comment, perdón. Levanta la mano, no te veo.
Yo no quiero monopolizar, but coming to Eduardo's proposal, I think that similar to what you mentioned, but probably a little more flexible, is what we tried to reach during Euro round negotiations, and actually we failed. That was for each change, try to reach specific agreements. And this was 0 to 0 or specific agreements. So if we approach in a more general strategy, probably this could be easier than trying to set just a fixed proposal. But this is, it was also very difficult for us because we tried to do that for the oilseed sector during the Euro round, and at the end of the day we failed because we offered, well, we eliminate everything if you eliminate everything. But not just asking the 0 por 0 strategy, probably trying to discuss this kind of issues without saying this is a specific proposal, just this, it would be more flexible, I think.
Somebody at the very end. Ah, Bellman.
Oh, thank you. Maybe two quick questions, and sorry I missed some of the presentation. So maybe the point that I'm making has been covered already. But on this issue of kind of trading off, making a trade-off between export restrictions on the one hand and tariff escalation, well, it sounds interesting. But in practice, it's going to be quite difficult to define exactly what we mean by tariff escalation. We keep hearing the example of, for example, cocoa and chocolate. So the tariff on cocoa may be 0 and chocolate might be higher. That's not tariff escalation, because the higher tariff on chocolate might very well represent the content in milk or the content in sugar. When you have oranges with a low tariff and a higher tariff on orange juice, that's not necessarily tariff escalation. That reflects the sugar content of the product. So there will be a lot of cases where defining exactly what we mean by tariff escalation is going to be difficult and will require consensus among members. The other point is more on the proposal regarding the basically tariff preferences for goods that don't or that generate zero emission. Here, I think it is also going to be exceedingly difficult, because that would imply that you have an international consensus on how do we measure actually greenhouse gases emissions associated with a particular product. And I think you would have to include not only greenhouse gases emissions generated in the production process, but probably also in the transport, which will differ from one country to the other. Another element which is even more complicated is this notion of emissions associated with land use change or indirect land use change. So in other words, how do we factor that in, and how do we measure that? And more specifically, how do we get an international consensus on how this is going to be measured? To me, it looks like a very or exceedingly complicated approach. Thank you.
Before asking if the panel wants to comment on your comments, Chris, one question, because I don't understand, and maybe people in the audience don't understand either. Why would the sugar mean that is not a tariff escalation? In the example of the orange and the juice.
The argument would be that tariff on, say, in my country, for example, I'm just making a case, I have a 0 tariff on oranges, but I would have a 5 or 10% tariff on orange juice. And my argument is that this may reflect that when you produce orange juice, you not only put oranges, but you also put sugar. So if in my country I tax sugar at 10%, then if I give you 0% on orange juice, it means I'm basically encouraging you to export sugar to my countries through orange. So that's tariff desescalation for sugar. You see, so that's just the point. The complexity I'm trying to illustrate in that case.
Yeah, probably is my intention, but anyway, that's a different thing. But besides the joke, who would like to answer to these comments? Same.
Okay, thank you for the question, but I think that probably you are right, and that's why the proposal thinks about agreements by production chains, so that you can take into account the particularities of each production chain. Thank you.
Okay. Gustavo?
Yeah, two things. First of all, at Mercosur, we already discussed 10 years ago about tariff escalation, and we identify a full list of products under this concept of tariff escalation based on tariff line. You are talking about orange, and we are talking about orange juice. Exactly, we are talking about tariff escalation. So it doesn't mean we don't care about the sugar component. We know that for some countries it's quite important to try to stop export from Brazil. We know that. That's the reason why we are discussing the WTO. But we don't really care about the sugar component or the other kind of ingredient that can compose that. We are talking about added value, production and export, and in that reference, tariff escalation for us is the largest distortion on the market right now. We only export raw materials, and if we want to export an added value product or processed product, then we received larger import tariffs. So that's the reason why we are talking about this kind of deal with export restriction, because it's the only things that we have on the table that many imported countries want to prohibit. So it's the only point that we have on the agenda to try to negotiate. That's the reason why Eduardo introduced this proposal. Based on the other proposal, you are right about methodology, and you are right about transport. And that's the reason why we pointed out that we need to go to the ISO methodology. The ISO methodology is a life cycle assessment. It's well recognized worldwide. And that's the reason why we set this methodology as the only methodology recognized. We know that there is an important discussion worldwide about the IPPC values and the way that they are elaborated, so we decided to go directly to the ISO. We are confident that the problem is not the methodology. The problem is the political decision to go ahead on this.
Thank you. We can accommodate one last question. Laborde.
Yes, thank you for the panel and the discussion. I have two comments/questions. The first one is on tariff escalation. I think that the composition of the product, as it has been discussed, may not be tariff escalation, and for some countries it's a formula and it's documented. I'm not saying that it's right. I just say that it's because you have a very high level of protection on milk and sugar, that they also need to have a high level of protection on chocolate and cookies. Now, I just want also to make clear that I think in many cases there is too many hopes in this tariff escalation story. It's true that if you look at the MFN structure, we have tariff escalation. Now, if you look at what's happened when you had bilateral agreements between the EU and Mexico, EU-Chile, or even EU and most of the African countries, even EU-South Africa, the part of processed product that has to be exported when all this tariff escalation has been removed has not been so significant. So there are a lot of other barriers or just value chain specialization that lead to this. So I will not argue in keeping tariff peaks and tariff escalation. I just want to say, in many cases, I see negotiators fighting for it, but the amount of gain you can get from this, you should be careful and look, okay, I'm really competitive to go up on this, how other countries have performed. And I think for the EU-Mercosur negotiation, that hopefully you will have no tariff escalation if there is an agreement. But there's other barriers or other challenges to go up in the value chain. When we talk about value added and to kind of challenge you on your ID, do you think that the export taxes, especially on the oilseed sectors, is creating so much value added for a country like Argentina compared to the value added that was lost by not expanding basically the primary production? because the crushing industry itself has very narrow margin in terms of creating value added. Most of this margin go to the capital and not to the labor. So in terms of job and value added creating jobs, some of these export taxes in reality are not so productive because you are losing a lot of expansion of your primary sectors and you try to concentrate some gains on the processing part, but the processing industry per se is not creating value added. You need to know what is your share of value added at different level of transformation, and you need to keep in mind who is getting this value added, capitalists or workers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Somebody who wants to say something? No? Sí. Gustavo, and we will finish the panel.
Yeah, just a short comment about added value and differential export taxes. Our view is different from what you have mentioned, and I will put only one example. Is that the case of the oilseed production industry in Argentina? First of all, the differential export taxes has never been negative to the incremental of production of soybean in Argentina. Each campaign, it doesn't depend to the level of export taxes, it depends to any other input and condition in Argentina and the international price. And in the timing that we have export taxes, our production of soybean has been increasing. So we can say that there is a positive effect. The second one is that we are industrializing on the added value change many products that we never think that we are going to produce, like glycerin. Who will think that Argentina, developing countries, is going to be the first supplier for all medical products worldwide of glycerin if we don't have differential export taxes? That's the only reason that we have that kind of policy.
Well, thank you, Gustavo, for the answer. Let me say that I don't agree with the answer, but anyway, I'm the
That's why we are friends.
supposedly the moderator. Thank you very much to the panelists, and many thanks to all of you. Thank you.